Number 80 on our AFI countdown is 1960's The Apartment. I've talked in this series before about revisiting classics I've loved and my personal experiences with them. It's fun watching a movie you haven't seen in a while, but one that you like, not one that you hate. A whole different thrill is falling into a movie that was never on your radar, but after watching it you wonder why and how it was never on your radar. The Apartment was one of those movies for me. I didn't know what this was about, who was in it, or anything other than the fact that it came out in 1960. Going in cold removed any issues of preconceived notions or jumping to conclusions. The Apartment follows everyman C.C. Baxter, expertly played by Jack Lemmon. He works for a massive life insurance company where he would be just another cog in the great machinery of business in the 1950s, 60s. He states in the opening narration that nearly 32,000 people work in the building. There's a great shot that has people working at desks as far as the eye can see. Writer-director Billy Wilder had a genius way of getting this shot. 1959 didn't really have the computer effects that would be used today. Instead, Wilder cast a bunch of adults to work at desks in the foreground. The middle ground, he actually cast children to be working at smaller desks, and in the deep background, he created puppets, actually controlled with strings, to fill out the rest. It's a pretty ingenious shot when you see the final result. Anyway, Baxter would have been just another cog in the machine if he didn't have a conveniently located apartment he was willing to lend to his bosses. Now, describing this movie is going to sound a little skeevy, but stick with it. The movie is actually charming and turns out to be surprisingly ahead of its time in a lot of ways. So Baxter would lend his apartment to the higher-ups at work for evenings here and there so they could have affairs without their wives finding out. If you watched Mad Men, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Since Baxter himself is not having an affair, and the movie follows him, it's played off for laughs at the inconvenience it's causing Baxter, rather than the sliminess of the other characters. Baxter becomes all the more charming to the movie audiences when they see his polite, innocent flirting with Fran Kubelik, played by Shirley MacLaine. Fran works the elevator at the massive office building that houses the insurance company in question. The men around her are rude, crass, and even go as far to touch her on the way out the door. Given the day this movie was made in, Fran mostly shrugs off these advances, where today it would come down to something more like assault. Now, they never get too far, they're not really attacking her, but it is certainly inappropriate and definitely jarring looking back at it with a 21st century lens. It's clear that Baxter is into Fran, and it's clear to the audience that Fran is hung up on someone else. Baxter persists and eventually scores a date with her. Fran ends up standing him up on that date to spend an evening with another man, who it turns out is the very man who just gave Baxter his big promotion. So the mid-level managers who were borrowing Baxter's apartment help him score this promotion. They all put in a good word for him with the top brass. Jeff Sheldrake, played by Fred MacMurray, is that top brass, and he is the other man. When he gives Baxter the promotion, he doesn't dance around the fact that it's because Baxter has an accessible apartment that he can use for his affair. Baxter reluctantly lets his boss use the apartment, not knowing it's to have an affair with the same woman Baxter himself loves. The threads of the plot weave in and out, and the subject matter is a bit gross, but the movie is kept light and it's generally played for laughs. Jack Lemmon has this very period way of speaking, and the narration he provides throws you right back into the area the movie was made. Even filming the movie in black and white, though color film was easily available in 1959, did something to make it feel older and, despite being a movie about affairs, kinda wholesome. I really didn't think I'd be using that word when talking about The Apartment. I'm not alone in finding the movie both skeevy and charming at the same time. Critics at the time were also split. Some praised it for the Baxter-led plot points of love, charisma, and sentimentality, while others maligned it for depicting adultery affairs and even kind of making light of suicide. If you ask me, they don't really make light of suicide. At the top of the video, I had mentioned I felt the movie was ahead of its time. The Apartment dealt with major subject matter: affairs, infidelity, treating women like property, suicide. These things don't pop their heads up all too often in late 50s, early 60s mainstream entertainment. Look at their top TV shows and the other movies that came out at the same time. Counterculture, a term that I really beat into the ground in the Easy Riser video, was just starting to creep up. This movie came out before history shows the big schism in culture. Another place I felt this movie really soared, ahead of what I expected from the era, is in the story of Fran. The movie followed Baxter, but I felt Fran had the best plot and most character development. There's a great scene where the beginning of Fran's self-awareness really starts. It's tragic in the middle of what's primarily a comedy, but so poignant. She gets Sheldrake a Christmas present and gives it to him at the titular apartment. Sheldrake didn't think to get her something. He talks big about leaving his wife for her, but it's clear he has no real care for Fran. He hands her a $100 bill and some lame excuses. Fran unenthusiastically starts to take her outerwear off, saying that Sheldrake already paid for it, so she might as well. Now this jab at him, it's coming from a dark place, but it's a moment of awareness at her situation and the start of her taking control. She backslides by downing half a bottle of sleeping pills, a tragic moment for sure, but when she comes through, she has a better outlook on life. It still takes her a Hollywood amount of time to really come around, but when she does, it's charming as hell. The suicide part of the movie was also handled with much more competence than I thought it would have. Baxter gets his neighbor, a doctor, to come help. He gets her to puke, he wakes her up, and makes some actually intelligent steps to fix the problem. Aside from slapping the hell out of her while jamming smelling salts under her nose, the whole scene was handled with at least some measure of care. A bit of lack of understanding at the mental aspects of it, but still a solid display and something else I had never seen in a project from this time. There was some more subtlety on the subject of the apartment being ahead of its time. Billy Wilder was one of the first directors to really properly utilize hooks in his films. Jack Lemmon, very prolific actor, spent a lot of time on sets, said that he learned about this technique from Wilder. The hooks are small bits or gags in a movie that worm their way into the audience's brain and stay with them long after the final credits roll. Lemmon said for years after the movie's release, people would approach him and ask him for the key to the apartment. That is one of the hooks. The idea for this movie kicked around Hollywood for nearly 2 decades before it could finally be made. Despite the fact that there were rampant affairs going on according to every bit of pop culture I've ever seen, you couldn't make a movie depicting affairs in the 1940s. Hollywood's history seems to be plagued with hypocrisies like this, so no huge shock. I think it's safe to say there's a good chance that some of the men who turned down this movie were not the most moral people themselves, and that's putting it lightly. Billy Wilder worked with some of Hollywood's biggest, most timeless stars. He was a stickler to do things his way. He was obsessive about his scripts and did not allow for much ad-libbing, in most cases. Now in The Apartment, there are a few times where Lemmon got to ad-lib. One being the song as he strained the spaghetti on a tennis racket making for dinner for Fran, which is a very memorable scene in the movie. Wilder thought that Lemmon was a tremendous actor who could do no wrong. He considered him the next Charlie Chaplin. The same courtesy was not extended to Shirley MacLaine. She had to redo a scene 5 times because she missed a single word. It's not as bad as what Kubrick did to Shelley Duvall in The Shining, but I imagine still pretty annoying. The split reviews from the critics didn't stop audiences or the Academy of Motion Pictures. The Apartment was made for a budget of just $3 million and would go on to gross $18.7 million. That's a great return. The movie won a total of 5 Academy Awards. Best Picture, Best Director, Best Writing Directly for the Screen, all went to Billy Wilder. The writing credit was shared with I.A.L. Diamond. It also won Best Art Direction for a black and white movie and Best Film Editing. The movie would go on to win an additional 19 awards from other sources. Lemmon and MacLaine were both nominated for lead actor and actress respectively, but neither got to take home the statue. Wilder's big award win made him the first person to win picture, director, and screenplay. Given the modern feel, tackling subject matter, and nailing the tone of the movie, it's no wonder The Apartment is still considered one of the best movies of all time. In 1994, it was deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant, a phrase I'm sure you've heard me say a few times now, by the United States Library of Congress, who then preserved it. Just a quick side note, while I really enjoyed The Apartment, I have to say it came out the same year as last week's movie, Spartacus, and Spartacus would still have been my vote for Best Picture. That's going to do it for 1960's The Apartment. Thanks for watching. Be sure to come back next week for number 79, The Wild Bunch from 1969. The AFI Countdown videos hit a week early for our patrons on Patreon. Tiers start at only $1 a month and you get multiple monthly bonus shows for it. Don't forget to listen to So Wizard Podcast every single week wherever you get your podcasts. SoWizardPodcast.com is your resource for reviews, recommendations, videos, merchandise, and more. We love hearing feedback, so drop us a note in the comments or leave us something on social media. All of our accounts can be found after the show and in the show notes. Thanks again.